Good afternoon. My name is Tina Kepi, and I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held on the third Thursday of every month in room 303 on the third floor of the City County Building at 555 South 10th Street in Lincoln. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television and on our YouTube page. Today's speaker is Frank Edler, philosophy instructor who taught at Metropolitan Community College in Omaha for 20 years. He will be speaking about C.A. Sorensen and the Henry Ford Peace Expedition. Please join me in welcoming Frank Edler.
Thank you so much, Tina. I was a philosopher for quite a while, but I still am. But moved to Nebraska in 1990 with my wife, who was a native Omahan, and got involved in Nebraska history, most especially the professor's trial of 1918, which a lot of people don't know much about. But more importantly, with the Nebraska Peace Society, which was established in 1912 and then had its demise in 1918. And I will talk about the Nebraska Peace Society too, because there were 4 Nebraskans that went on the peace ship. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself here. First, I'd like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society. I had wanted to thank Tom Bucher, who puts together these series in person, of course. Tom sadly has passed away, and I didn't know him, but whenever I went to see him, I mean, I didn't know him well, but whenever I went to see him, he had such a love of history, it just sort of gushed out of him. So I'd like to read this poem. It's a poem by Mark Strand for Tom. It's called Lines for Winter. Tell yourself as it gets cold and gray falls from the air that you will go on, walking, hearing the same tune no matter where you find yourself. Inside the dome of dark or under the cracking white of the moon's gaze in a valley of snow. Tonight as it gets cold, tell yourself what you know, which is nothing but the tune your bones play. As you keep going, and you will be able for once to lie under the small fire of winter stars. And if it happens that you cannot go on and turn back and find yourself where you will be at the end, tell yourself in that final flowing of cold through your limbs that you love what you are. Anyway, I mourn his passing. I'd also like to thank people that have helped me immensely. Most of my research I've done at Love Library Archives and at the research room at the Nebraska State Historical Society. And those at the archive that I'd like to thank are Pete Brink and Josh Castor, who've helped me a great deal. And also at the research room of the Nebraska State Historical Society, Tom Mooney, Mary Jo Miller, and Matt Pearsall have been really helpful too. So I guess without further ado, let me start the presentation. But before I do, oops, it's not moving ahead. The arrow up is forward. Yeah, arrow up is not...
Right, to the right. Hit the right arrow.
Oh, the right arrow?
It's up and down.
There it is. I got it. Thank you. Before I start part of this, but anyway, this presentation actually I'd like to dedicate to Paul Olson, who's with us, and I'd like to recognize Paul Olson. And I'd like to dedicate it to him for his distinguished and tireless work on behalf of justice, peace, and nonviolence. So I'm really pleased that Paul was able to make it today. So, okay, I'm going to start with the great event, right, of the Oscar II leaving Hoboken Harbor, New Jersey on December 4th, about, I think, 2:15 or 2:30 in the afternoon. The Oscar II was a Swedish-American steamer, and actually Henry Ford hired a second, or at least most of the cabins on a second steamer, also from the Scandinavian American line. It was called the Frederick VIII and left a couple of days later than the Oscar II because they put this thing together in such a short time that there were people who got to New York and the Oscar II had already left. So in a sense, the second steamer was to take the overflow crowd. And the Frederick VIII was a faster steamer, so they hoped that, you know, they'd be able to catch up. And anyway, most people are, this is what, December 4th, 2015, will be, of course, the 100th anniversary, right, of the departure of the Henry Ford peace ship. And most people are not aware that there were 4 Nebraskans on board, right? Arthur Weatherly was on board. Arthur Weatherly was the secretary of the Nebraska Peace Society, which had been formed in 1912. I'll get into that a little bit. The other one is Weatherly, of course, the Unitarian minister of All Souls Church, right, in Lincoln. C.A. or Christian Abraham Sorensen at the time, 1915, was a law student at the University of Nebraska. And when he came back, he had to quickly hurry and finish his courses because he had been gone for about 2 months. Walter Hickson Bow was another student at the University of Nebraska and a friend of Sorensen's. And Will Noble was, again, another student from the University of Nebraska. And he didn't have, I don't think, a connection to the other 3, but the Henry Ford folks sent invitations to chancellors of various universities asking them to choose a student to go. And that's how Will Noble went, because Chancellor Samuel Avery, right, chose him to go on the expedition. So this is Sorensen as an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska. He's also known by his friends as Abe or C.A. He graduated in June of 1913 as an undergraduate and then went into law school and graduated in June 1916 after he came back from the expedition with his law degree. This is also a 1915, a little bit later. Sorensen is a law student. It's from the Cornhusker, 1915 Cornhusker. And let me just talk a little bit about him. He was born in 1890 in a sod house near Harrisburg, Nebraska, to a very devout pacifist Christian Danish immigrants. And he was the oldest of 10 children, and so he really had to bear the brunt of the farm work. I think it may be easier when he was a little bit older, right, for the other children to start bearing that brunt, or, you know, but I think, and that's why when he went to Grand Island College, Baptist College, he was 21 years old when he enrolled, right? Anyway, he was at Grand Island College. He was editor of the Volante, which is the student newspaper, and competed in an oratory contest on February 16th, 1912. He was expelled from Grand Island Baptist College because he refused to, in his oratory, to change parts of his speech that the faculty said, you must not read this, you must read this. So he was expelled. And luckily, Arthur Weatherly, that I've already mentioned, and Walter Locke. Walter Locke was also a member of the Unitarian Church, but Walter Locke was also the associate editor of the Nebraska State Journal. And so they sort of intervened and helped him, that is, Sorensen, to enroll in the University of Nebraska. And he did so rather quickly by February the 27th. So he got a fast track to the University of Nebraska. Okay, and for those of you who are interested, this is, I pulled out some, at least, of the text so you can get a flavor of why he was expelled, right, or dismissed, if you will. Maybe, I don't know if that's a nicer term. But anyway, so you see, this is from his oration. We offer up our prayers before the time-honored, before the shrine of time-honored falsehoods. But we are beginning to see that the essence of the religious life is the science of the duty of man to man, and not a fantastical belief in a supernatural and mythological scheme of heavenly things. True religion needs no supernatural equipment. The mission of true religion is not to give a system of theology, nor a doctrine about gods, but to proclaim the union of all men in a bond of ideal brotherhood, right? So you can see how that probably rankled faculty and administration of the Grand Island Baptist College. Okay, on the right here is the masthead of the Advocate of Peace. The Advocate of Peace is a monthly journal put out by the American Peace Society. The write-up here that you see is only a part of the write-up, but it's describing the establishment of the Nebraska Peace Society. On the left, I'll read a little bit of it, but on the left is a picture, a photograph from the Omaha Daily Bee on November 27th, 1915, shortly before Weatherly left to go on the peace expedition. Weatherly has a huge, unfortunately, he's one of these unsung Nebraskans, but he's known as the father of the Employment Compensation Bill in Nebraska, among many other things. Great advocate of women's suffrage, and, you know, anyway. Let me just say something. I think Nebraska in 1915 is not the Nebraska of today. The Nebraska of 1915 is a progressive state. And a lot of progressives are Republicans. And I think people, it's hard to get your mind around that sometimes, I think, to go back to that period. And I think sometimes people tend to remember, for example, that Teddy Roosevelt, you know, speak softly and carry a big stick, and his World War I, you know, patriotism, and forget that in 1912 he ran as the head of the Progressive Party, right, as a presidential candidate. And so, which, by the way, that Progressive Party had a huge raft of, you know, they were for the popular election of senators, they were for the referendum, they were for the initiative. I mean, really democratizing in a greater way the United States. Okay, so, but the Advocate of Peace, right, is really announcing the establishment of the Nebraska Peace Society. If you read that Professor George E. Howard of the Political Science and Sociology Department at the University of Nebraska was elected president. The honorary president was William Jennings Bryan, and really they had over about 180 members from on the first year, and it almost reads like a cross-section of a who's who in Nebraska. And Weatherly, of course, Weatherly was elected secretary, right, of the Nebraska Peace Society. So I'll just go through a little. Here's a picture of George. We could say just massive things about this guy. This guy is just so huge, and he's been another unsung, really a founder of sociology in the United States, along with Edward Ross. But anyway, he went to, in 1890, he was hired from Nebraska to go to establish the Department of History at Stanford University when A colleague, Edward Ross, was fired, right, for making criticisms about the coolies in California. Howard said, I'm out of here, I'm resigning. So, there were people who really took incredible stands, right, for academic freedom and so on, early on. Anyway, he was the first president of the Nebraska Peace Society, and later he was president of the American Sociological Society in 1917. The honorary president, of course, is William Jennings Bryan. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar somewhat with William Jennings Bryan. He was honorary president all the way through the Nebraska Peace Society. And of course, he was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, right? People tend to forget that too, from 1913 to 1915. He resigned after the sinking of the Lusitania because he disagreed with President Wilson. He didn't feel that Wilson was balanced enough. It was all about Germany and Lusitania and not about the transgressions that Britain was taking too, because you have to remember, Britain had a blockade around Germany, right? And any ship, they'd stopped any ship, well, we'll talk more about that, and confiscated whatever they want to. And anyway, I know that doesn't quite map up to or match with the sinking of the Lusitania. But anyway, so he resigned in June of 1915 and then spent most of his time, the remainder of the time, really trying to, he was sort of the other bookend to Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt by this time too was really starting to rattle his saber and trying to push Wilson towards a greater preparedness and really join the war with the Allies. And so it's interesting to see those two as sort of bookends in that conflict about whether the United States should remain neutral or not. Okay. And 1915 is really the year of the woman in terms of the war. On the left, you have a very young Jane Addams. I found it interesting. Usually, I know, unfortunately, she's sort of, in the older picture, she seems like a Victorian matron a lot of the times. But, so I wanted you to see, perhaps a more vibrant, younger Jane Addams. Of course, she's the founder of Hull House and a whole lot of other things. And finally being recognized as a really true sociologist and really how much she influenced the Chicago School of Sociology, right? Symbolic Interaction School of Sociology. Anyway, so women, of course, had already been organized with regards to women's suffrage. But prominent women like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald, most people know about Hull House with Jane Addams, but Lillian Wald had the Henry Street settlement in New York in the lower Manhattan Jewish section. And Tina was just telling me about a renovated tenement building that as a museum that they've done. But anyway, you have to remember the age of progressivism, really at the center of it was social reform. Greater democratization, equality, to be achieved through social reform, and prominent women like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald saw that they would lose whatever progress they had made in social reform if the United States went to war. I mean, that would just all go down the drain. And so when the war began in August of 1914, the first protest, interestingly, against the slaughter was the Women's Peace Parade down Fifth Avenue in New York. And somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 women walked silently, either wearing black or white, walked silently to muffled drums, right? So it was but it was one of those, that just sort of caught people's attention, because the older peace societies were really doing squat. I mean, the American Peace Society just sort of tended to withdraw, right, to some extent, and not take more active. So what you basically see is about 1915 and after, there are a whole lot of peace societies that spring up that are much more active, right, in terms of their their opposition to the war, and trying to actively do things. Because the American Peace Society was the older kind of, sorry, stuffy Victorian sort of society that would make resolutions and send the resolutions to their congressmen and the president, and that would be just about it, right? I mean, there was no sort of active attempt to engage the political process. So in order to organize women in the promotion of peace, the Women's Peace Party was founded in January of 1915, and Jane Addams was the first, right, national president of that. And Carrie Chapman Catt in women's suffrage was also instrumental in sort of helping that get established. Okay, here are a number of the delegates. Let me just, this is sort of an important crux here, because a lot of people miss this part of the Ford Peace Expedition and just get sort of caught up in the, you know, the ridicule that was heaped on it, or the hype, but you can't really understand the purpose of the Henry Ford Peace Expedition without understanding what happened at the Women's Peace Congress. And here, this photo was taken aboard the Noordam, SS Noordam. That was the ship that I believe 40 of the delegates from the Women's Peace Party went to the International Congress of Women at The Hague in late April of 1915. Let me show you at least Jane Addams. Anyway, so that's where I'm heading with it, to try to give you a sense of what the background is to this, because it becomes the purpose of the Henry Ford Peace Expedition. This is from front page of the Sun, New York Sun. It's Saturday, May 22nd, 1915. This photograph is a photograph of all the delegates that went, but as you can see, it's after the conference. And I'd also like to show you a couple of people. The first I'll show you is Jane Addams. The second person I'll show you is Julia Grace Wales. She is University of Wisconsin graduate who came up with the idea of continuous mediation, which is a central part of the Neutral Conference Committee. The third person I'll show you is Lois Lochner, who's in the back row, who's peeking out from behind a woman. Lois Lochner knew Jane Addams from the Chicago Peace Society, but he was her secretary on the mission to the International Women's Conference at The Hague. Yeah, he's important too, because he'll get involved in other, the more radical peace societies that get established. Okay, one of the most important, this is the important part, one of the most important resolutions that came out of the Congress was a plan to organize a conference of neutral European nations to engage the warring nations in a process of mediation to end the war. This plan for a continuous mediation committee composed of neutral nations, that plan, the women from the Congress, or at least a number of them, took it upon themselves. And by the way, we haven't met Brassica Schwimmer yet, who is a Hungarian women's suffrage champion. But after the war, she came to the United States and gave speeches, you know, talks against the war and so on, and we'll see her in just a moment. But it was her idea at the end of the Congress to, you know, don't just send it to them. She was really about enough with talk. Do something, right? So groups of women took the proposals and hand-delivered them to the heads of state of the neutral nations and the warring nations. So they meant business. After Jane Addams and other delegates came home, right, and this is the late summer of 1915, after delivering, right, these proposals to European heads of state, they all their money went to, going over there. And so they really had no funds left to try to establish a neutral committee in Europe. And so they needed the money to do that. By early fall of 1915, Henry Ford and his wife Clara had become increasingly concerned about the slaughter of the war and the U.S. pro-war agitation. And here I want to enter Rebecca Shelley. She's a young, feisty pacifist. She's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Michigan. She went to the International Peace Conference, and it was really her push that finally got the first meeting together with Schwimmer and Lochner and Ford, and we'll go to that in just a moment. This is a picture of Rebecca Shelley. And here's a photo of the three of them. That's Brassica Schwimmer on the left, Ford, of course, seated on the right, and Lois Lochner in a rather stiff, formal, I think, pose behind Ford. But what's important about this first meeting is that Ford agreed to fund the proposals that the women had passed at the International Congress at The Hague. And before leaving, Ford had a meeting with President Wilson on November 23rd, 1915, and suggested not only that he appoint a neutral committee, but that he also come along for the voyage. Wilson was rather taken aback, refused to go, and then Ford said that he would do it on his own in an unofficial capacity. So I think quite a few peace societies had already had talks with Wilson to try to get something like a neutral conference going. And Wilson would dither each time and said, well, the conditions aren't right, or we don't really have a commitment yet, right, by the two or by the belligerent countries and so on. So sort of nothing ever came of it. So I think that was part of Ford's frustration. And so the Oscar II, right, filled with peace delegates and journalists and students. There were about 40 students that went, sailed on December the 4th. And the first stop they made was at Christiania, which is now, of course, Oslo. And Ford had already been sick on the way over and got sicker, but he sort of left suddenly without telling anybody. And so there's, always perhaps a little feeling of abandonment. But anyway, he did not abandon the conference financially, right? He continued to support it. And the peace mission continued on to Stockholm, to Copenhagen. And interestingly, they were allowed to take a train through Germany, right, from got to go down right from Denmark across Germany and then over to Holland or the Netherlands. And this was sort of the ad part, right? In each country, they would try to drum up support, right, for a neutral conference. Again, I think people sort of miss or just think it was just an ad stunt without understanding the deeper things that they were trying to do. The main focus, however, right, was always on establishing a neutral conference committee that would exercise diplomacy for continuous mediation. So although he left, he continued to support it, and a neutral conference committee was indeed established in Stockholm with 5 delegates from each of the neutral countries, Norway, Holland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland, the United States, and officially convened on February 28, 1916. Those not involved in the neutral committee left to return to the United States in mid-January, and most of them got back towards the end of January. And so, even, as I say, even today, scholarly sources miss the point One major university website, not too far from Nebraska, describes the Ford expedition in the following way, quote, "Having no patience for diplomacy, Ford believed that if he could only get foreign leaders to sit down in a room, he would make them listen to reason and the war would end. Straight talk from a no-nonsense businessman would persuade where diplomatic double talk had failed," unquote. This, of course, is nonsense and simply repeats sort of the popular misunderstanding of the time of the Ford peace expedition. I mean, it's true that Ford did have that side to him, right? No-nonsense business, but I think part of it, too, I think he realized that he was out of his depth when it came to diplomacy. And so it may have been part of his decision to leave because he felt in a way that he had the people there who did have the knowledge to try to establish a neutral committee, and that he would sort of be, after a while, a third wheel, perhaps. But anyway. So at the end of January, Weatherly II returns to Nebraska, and this is the write-up in the Daily Nebraskan. If you're not familiar with it, it's the student newspaper at the University of Nebraska. And on February the 10th, he gave a convocation address at the University of Nebraska on the peace expedition. And I'll just read the first, the quote at the very top on the right. He says, "For the first time in the history of the world, a group of common people of one nation met with those from other nations to work together for peace." On the peace expedition, on the way home, Sorensen made fast friends with two really important women. One you've already met, Rebecca Shelley, and the other is LaFace Secker. Rebecca and Lela were friends, but all three, that is Rebecca, Lela, and Sorensen, sort of formed a compact on their way home, right, to New York, aboard the Rotterdam. And what they wanted to do was establish an international youth movement to end war. And Rebecca wanted to interest, when they got back, Rebecca wanted to interest Ford in such a movement, and Sorensen even wrote a detailed description of the movement to be sent to Ford, but nothing came of it. And so in Nebraska, Sorensen came back and continued his activities to promote peace, but more importantly, I think, finished his law degree. And Rebecca and Lela stayed in New York, where Rebecca mostly, but with Lela's help too, established the peace organization known as the American Neutral Conference Committee. So they got like a list of 100 donors and really, got the organization off the ground. Now, after Sorensen graduates from law school, how many of you, some of you probably familiar with Addison E. Sheldon, yes? Longtime director of the Nebraska State Historical Society, author of a 3-volume book on Nebraska, The Land and Its People, big. One of the really interesting things that he did was, this is, I think, 1909, went to the University of Nebraska where they had established a legislative reference bureau. Part of what they wanted to do was the knowledge of the university shouldn't just stay at the university or be used by people to get jobs. The knowledge of the university should help legislature, because a lot of times state legislators, when they're elected, don't even know how to write a bill. As a matter of fact, Sheldon actually taught a course on practical politics, where most of the students, a very popular course, who took it were, on the whole, lawyers, but these lawyers helped, through the Legislative Reference Bureau, helped state legislators write bills. They even had a small library, right, where they could focus on Nebraska issues and have some background. Anyway, so short of it, Addison Sheldon hires Sorensen as his assistant director, and I think his title is counselor and assistant director of the Legislative Reference Bureau, which is a big, sort of a big deal. That's right after he graduates from law school. So, moving ahead a little bit, on December 17th, 1916, more than a year after the beginning of the Forward Peace Expedition, I want to show you how close these three are. That is Rebecca Shelley, LaFace and Sorensen. This is what she writes to Sorensen. I cannot tell you how often we have, and this is a year after they've come back, right? I mean, from the peace expedition. I cannot tell you how often we have longed for you and how frequently I myself have drawn upon your fine strength and courage. Both Rebecca and I feel that the fight we are making now is only preliminary to the tremendous struggle into which you and we shall enter when the war is over. Our young people's plan thrills and inspires me. It has stood out as a sort of beacon light through all these hard months, unquote. So we're approaching the time of U.S. entry, right, into the war, which is April 6, 1917. This is a March 1916 cartoon by Oscar Cesar, which shows Jingo, the American war dog, howling for war outside the front door of the White House. Throughout 1916, the pro-war forces in the U.S. had been gaining strength. Although the Middle West was not convinced that war was necessary, and actually the Midwest got a lot of, at some point, I think they, on a sort of speaker circuit, they would do it in the Middle West, but not as much in the East, because the East was much more pro-war than the Middle West was. So. But anyway, when Germany resumed unrestricted, submarine warfare on February the 1st, 1917, when Wilson broke off diplomatic relations, and Rebecca and Lela lost all their backing for the American Neutral Conference Committee. So what did they do? By now they were known as the Peace Twins in New York. They put an ad in the New York Times and raised $35,000 to start a new organization, which was called the American Peace Federation, which planned a demonstration in Washington for February the 12th, 1917, to persuade Wilson and Congress not to go to war. Interestingly, I don't think a lot of people know, and this surprised me because it's very subtle. I don't think the Farmers Union wanted to be known as belonging to a peace organization or going to Washington. But some members of the Nebraska Farmers Union, they're about 40,000 strong, joined the Peace Society at this time. Notably, anybody heard of C.H. Gustafson, because he was the head of the union? And L.S. Heron, who is the Nebraska Union Farmer, was the newspaper, that the union put out. Both of them joined the Nebraska Peace Society. And interestingly, Gustav and Sorensen went to Washington to be part of that February 12th demonstration in Washington. So here, by the way, is a flyer from the Emergency Peace Federation. And you can see the emphasis at this point is already on the West, Midwest and the West, against war. So Sorensen and Gustafson went to Washington to try to persuade President Wilson not to go to war or remain neutral. Sorensen specifically went to the White House to do this. He was one of three that were to go to see Wilson, but he was not there, or anyway. But he and the two others met with Joseph Tumulty, who was Wilson's private secretary, and sort of poured their hearts out, against going to war. But after the U.S. entered the Great War in April of 1917, Rebecca, Lilla, and Lois Lochner established perhaps the most radical, and notice this is established after the war had started, the most radical peace society, which was the People's Council of America, right? And that was a consolidation, right, of many pacifist, socialist, trade unions, labor unions, and that really scared the administration, because once unions were getting involved in a peace society, you know. Oops. Okay, this is a labor paper on the right. Headline is Terrorism. I'm jumping, of course, after the war to 1920 just for a moment. Oops, did I skip something? Nope, I did. With the passage of the Espionage Act and later the more repressive Sedition Act, and as a matter of fact, there's a separate name for the Sedition Act, but it's just, there were a number of amendments that were added to the Espionage Act, which formed the Sedition Act. Sedition Act was repealed, but Espionage Act has never been repealed. The Wilson administration, after the declaration of war, engaged in a systematic repression of dissent, the likes of which this country has never known. Thousands were tried and imprisoned simply for criticizing Wilson, the U.S., and even the Red Cross. Really, the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press were virtually non-existent. And German Americans, IWW, International Workers of the World, socialists, pacifists bore the brunt of the repression, which at times took the form of beatings, tar and featherings, whippings, and even hangings. Frank Little, an IWW, was hung off a bridge on the West Coast. And Robert Prager, who was hung in Collinsville, Illinois, for being a German, or German background. And back to, so here what I'm just trying to show is, you know, we tend to think of the Red Scare as being associated with the senator from Wisconsin during the early 50s. But the first Red Scare, of course, was right after World War I and lasted actually not just 1919 or 20, but even to 1922, where the incredible sort of war hysteria against Germans was sort of carried over into socialism and communism. And so that kind of repression continued. And below the terrorism there is not aimed at anarchists. Of course, there were massive strikes, right? There were bombs. But the terrorism there is aimed at the government's heavy-handed response to anarchism and labor strikes in the form of the Palmer raids and deportations. The sweeps of the Palmer raids were just horrendous in larger cities. They would just comb, you know, anything. They suspected you of anything, they pulled you in. So let me end. I'm not sure how we're doing in terms of time, but I think we're good. As repression grew during the war against anyone who wasn't 100% American, Sorensen really shifted from peace activism, which really sort of became useless. I mean, it was, you know, and really moved much more into the defense of civil liberties. He was a member of the General Committee of the People's Council of America, one of the most radical peace organizations. But they tended to, what they did during the war was try to see if labor in the United States could meet with labor in Great Britain to try to, you know, labor in Great Britain were pretty strong in terms of resisting the war in their own ways. But anyway, he was a counselor, right, for the Farmers Union, So he stayed on as a counselor with Gustafson and Heron. And he was also a counselor for the Nonpartisan League of Nebraska. I'm not sure, anyone familiar with the Nonpartisan League? Just a teeny bit. The 1913 or 1915, just before the war broke out, Arthur Townsley, right, was, actually he had been a socialist in North Dakota. And he got tired of socialism, but he also got tired of politicians in North Dakota telling the farmers, go home and slop the hogs and don't get involved in politics. So farmers really got ticked off about this and finally established their own political party, and that party is called the Nonpartisan League, and it started in North Dakota. And gee, the first year they just about swept the whole state in terms of state legislators. So it was a kind of state socialism where, you know, whether the farmers were tired of, you know, whether it's the weight of the grain or the silos or the railroads in terms of, you know, they were really sort of getting socked financially in a lot of ways. And so they decided, let's do our own grain elevators. Let's establish our own banks, right? And they did. So during the problem with the Nonpartisan League is it sort of began to be powerful right at the time when the repression started. I mean, Wilson knew that he didn't have a majority of people. I know a lot of people may think that, but the country was still quite divided. And so he knew he had to sort of deal with that kind of dissent and did deal with it in a heavy-handed way. For just one, you know, they didn't have electronic surveillance during this time, so what did they do? Well, one thing they did was recruit people. Anybody heard of the American Protective League? The APL had somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people who joined it, and all you had to do is, I think, pay $1, and you know, you got your card for your wallet. But the person who, I guess the historian, if you will, of the American Protective League, wrote a book after the war called The Web, where he claims they did 3 million investigations. And what investigations mean, that is about disloyalty especially, what the investigations mean is going into banks and finding out your you know, how much money you've got in the bank, so that if you're not paying enough on your Liberty loans, they're going to squeeze you to pay more. Or breaking into your house to see if, you know, anyway, it was just pretty horrendous. So as the Nonpartisan League tried to move into Minnesota, Nebraska, and, you know, other states, during the war they were met because people tried to paint them with the brush of disloyalty. So they had that to fight with during the war, and I think that I think it morphed to some extent into the farm labor movement a little bit later in the 20s. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but anyway. So it didn't quite die, but Sorensen also took on the repressive Nebraska State Council of Defense. 12 people were appointed by Governor Neville during the war to, you know, there was a National Council of Defense. Each state also had some version of its own State Council of Defense, which was support, really, the intent was to coordinate efforts for the war, right? That is, farming, railroads, you know, whatever was needed for the war effort. But what happened was the State Council got so involved with snooping out disloyalty that you know, they spent most of their time just sort of, you know, policing. And sort of three main parts of the population, German Americans and the Lutheran clergy and the University of Nebraska got hammered pretty heavily because, anyway, one. And so the Nebraska State Council of Defense also continued this whole notion that the Nonpartisan League shouldn't be organizing, right? They were disloyal and they shouldn't be organizing during the war. And so really what you got are vigilante groups that would go out, and wherever the Nonpartisan League would try to organize, they'd either beat them up or go through mock hangings and tell the organizers to get the hell out of the state. And so Sorensen and another really prominent lawyer of Lincoln, and people, I think the council was appalled that his name was Leonard Flansburgh, and his son was one of the first sons or first Nebraska boys that was killed in the war, decided to go with Sorensen and oppose the League and try to put a court order on him not to do these harassments anymore. Also, Sorensen defended 5 of the 12, initially 12, professors and staff members at the university. They were accused of disloyalty by the National Council of Defense, the State Council of Defense. And initially, 11 were professors and 1 was a staff member. Her name was Annis Chaikin. And there's a reason why Ted Sorensen's middle name is Chaikin, because he carries his mother's name. So Annis Chaikin, whom, right, Sorensen defended at the trial. It was held at the law school at the university. The board of trustees were the judge and jury, right? 3 professors were fired. 2 others were, but since they were on the good pro-war side, they were brought back. Anyway, it was pretty horrendous, but Sorensen, defended them when it was very unpopular, right, to do so. And of course, he most notably was known as for his role as Attorney General of Nebraska in 1928 to 1932. But I think there are a lot of other things that he's known for. I don't know how much time am I running okay? He was really instrumental in the promotion of rural electricity. That was one of his, and the loop electricity project. Remember, George Norris was into the TVA, right? Well, the Loop Valley project was known as the Little TVA. But one of the reasons why we have public power in this state, and I think Nebraska is the only state that has public power, is because of the legislation that Sorensen helped pass through. And of course, he was also, while he was Attorney General, he really focused on corruption. So let me just stop there, and I want to thank you all for coming on a snowy day. So, oh yeah. I assumed we would go immediately into questions, but if you'll speak up, I will repeat it because I don't think the mics can hear you. So please, if you have any questions.
How exceptional was it that you could pass through Germany in 1915?
Well, it's pretty exceptional. I think they got sort of worse treatment from the British. The usual line is that, oh, they sealed off the cars when they went through Germany, but the accounts that I've read of people who were on the expedition said they were treated well by the Germans. Of course, the British would go through the peace ship and go through all the mail, the papers, and confiscate whatever they wanted to. And so, anyway, yeah, it was. When you think about it, it's unusual. Yes?
Is there earlier evidence of a peace movement before the progressive era, perhaps in the late 19th century, is in Nebraska?
The question is there evidence of an earlier peace movement? I believe you said during or after the Civil War. in Nebraska or thereabouts. I'm not aware of any, and I'm not a Civil War scholar or, you know, go back. I mean, my expertise is more around this time period. But I can say that the American Peace Society was established, I believe in 1825. And so the American Peace Society, it became sort of a Boston Brahmins kind of, and it was a formation of the Nebraska Peace Society, and I think, I'm sorry, not Nebraska, Massachusetts Peace Society and the New York Peace Society, and some others got together during that time to establish the American Peace Society. But it was never active in that active way that we think of organizations today, sort of getting involved directly in politics to try to change things in some way. So I'm not sure. I hope I answered your question.
Was C.A. Sorensen related to Ted Sorensen?
Yes, C.H. Christian Abraham Sorensen. Let me go back and finish. He knew Annis Chaikin, right? He defended her during the professor's trial, so to speak. In 22, he marries her. And Ted Chaikin Sorensen is one of the sons that is born to Christian Abraham Sorensen and Annis Chaikin. Yes. I think, was it 4? I think they had 4 sons and 1 daughter, but don't quote me on that. Yes.
What was C.A. Sorensen's position with respect to the draft?
Good question. That's something he wrestled with terribly. Sort of perhaps in the way that perhaps pacifists wrestled with it during Vietnam, but he did register as having religious qualms, right? So, I mean, there is a card that shows him saying that he has religious reservations. But he waited until he was drafted, and he was indeed drafted in the latter part of the war. And I think he had been resigned to go. I think that's my best understanding of it. But the influenza, the flu epidemic was going on, and so they delayed his induction, and by the time he was to be inducted, the armistice, the war had already been, not over, but the armistice that was November 11th, right? The 11th hour, the 11th day. Yes, okay. Well, I think this is it. So thank you so much for coming, and stay warm. Thank you.